In 1991, the country of 24 million people vanished. Not overnight, but piece by piece, through war, genocide and betrayal. What caused one of Europe's most brutal breakups since World War II? This is the story of Yugoslavia's collapse, how a multi-ethnic federation shattered into bloodshed, why the world stood by, and what it still means today. One decision at a time, the warning signs were ignored until it was too late. What happens when the glue holding a nation together suddenly vanishes? In 1980, the death of Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslavia's longtime leader, sent a silent shockwave through the Balkans. Tito wasn't just a ruler, he was the delicate balancing act between fiercely different ethnic, religious, and national identities. For decades, he suppressed deep-rooted tensions with charisma, authoritarian control, and a vision of brotherhood and unity. Without him, the fragile federation began to wobble. His absence exposed old scars, fractures papered over by force and fear. Almost overnight, nationalist sentiments crept back into the political mainstream, whispering promises of independence and identity. Tito's death didn't just end an era, it opened a Pandora's box. Power struggles emerged, republics started pulling in opposite directions, and the clock started ticking on Yugoslavia's disintegration. Imagine a family already on edge, now suddenly hit with massive debt, job losses, and rising prices. That was Yugoslavia in the 1980s. With Tito gone, the country's economy spiraled into chaos. Foreign loans had ballooned, inflation was out of control, and unemployment skyrocketed, especially among the youth. The promise of a socialist paradise crumbled into long lines for bread and soaring frustration. The economy fractured along the same fault lines as the Federation. Republics like Slovenia and Croatia, more economically developed, resented sending money to poor regions like Kosovo or Macedonia. Meanwhile, the IMF's strict austerity measures only deepened public anger. As daily life grew harsher, people turned inward, toward ethnic identity and nationalist leaders who promised better futures. What fills the void when the unifying leader disappears and the economy collapses? In Yugoslavia, the answer was nationalism, loud, divisive, and dangerously seductive. Across the republics, opportunistic politicians ditched unity for identity. Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia rose swiftly, using fiery rhetoric to paint Serbs as victims and champions at once. In Croatia, Franjo Tuđman echoed similar themes of national pride and historical grievance. They didn't unite the people, they armed them with narratives. Ethnic identity became a political weapon. Leaders tapped into old wounds, World War II atrocities, historical betrayals, cultural divisions. Nationalist propaganda surged through newspapers, TV, and speeches, turning neighbors into enemies. What once was a fragile federation quickly turned into a battleground of ideologies. Here's the twist. Yugoslavia's collapse was written into law years before it happened. The 1974 Constitution, praised at the time for decentralization, granted unprecedented autonomy to the republics and even to autonomous provinces like Kosovo and Vojvodina. While it seemed like a democratic step forward, it quietly sowed the seeds of disunity. Each republic gained its own government, police, and even military structures. Unity on paper, separation in practice. This created a federation in name only, one where republics could ignore federal decisions and act in self-interest. When economic and political crises hit, the decentralized system became gridlocked. There was no strong federal mechanism to rein in rogue leaders or reconcile disputes. The republics weren't just drifting apart, they were being pulled by design. What happens when the smallest republic decides it's had enough? In 1991, Slovenia, wealthier, more Western-leaning, and culturally distinct, declared independence from Yugoslavia. It wasn't just a political move, it was a spark in a dry forest. The Yugoslav People's Army, JNA, dominated by Serb leadership, responded with force. But after just 10 days of skirmishes and limited casualties, the army withdrew. A federation lost its first peace with barely a fight. Slovenia's success sent a powerful message: leaving was possible. For other republics, especially Croatia and Bosnia, the path to independence no longer seemed theoretical. But unlike Slovenia, they were far more ethnically mixed, and their exits would come at a devastating price. If Slovenia's break was a spark, Croatia's was an explosion. Also declaring independence in 1991, Croatia immediately plunged into conflict, not just with the Yugoslav army, but with its own Serb population. Roughly 12% of Croatia's citizens were ethnic Serbs, many of whom feared marginalization in the new state. Backed by Belgrade, Serbian paramilitaries seized territory, igniting a brutal war. Civilians paid the price. Towns burned, lives shattered. The fighting was savage, sieges, massacres, and ethnic cleansing became horrifyingly common. Cities like Vukovar became symbols of destruction. The dream of independence turned into a nightmare of bloodshed. International recognition of Croatia came quickly, but peace wouldn't follow for years. What happens when a nation is split in three, ethnically, politically, and militarily? Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence in 1992, but unlike Slovenia or Croatia, it had no clear majority. Muslims, Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats lived side by side, often in the same cities. When the vote passed, boycotted by most Serbs, war erupted almost instantly. This wasn't a war between armies, it was a war between neighbors. Serb forces, supported by the Yugoslav army, launched brutal campaigns to carve out Greater Serbia. Ethnic cleansing, mass rape, and the shelling of civilians became tragically routine. Sarajevo endured the longest siege in modern history. The horror in Bosnia wasn't just a civil war, it was genocide in real time. Why would neighbors turn on each other after decades of coexistence? The answer lies in fear, stoked by propaganda, weaponized by leaders, and cemented by violence. During the Yugoslav wars, ethnic cleansing wasn't a side effect, it was a strategy. The goal? To create ethnically pure territories by forcibly removing or eliminating entire populations. Fear became the fuel. Violence made it permanent. Civilians were rounded up, displaced, or killed simply for being born on the wrong side of an invisible line. Entire towns were emptied. Cultural landmarks were destroyed. In places like Srebrenica, the world witnessed unspeakable atrocities. These weren't isolated crimes. They were systematic efforts to redraw the map with blood. Where was the world while Yugoslavia burned? At first, watching, hesitating, and misjudging, the international community underestimated the depth of the conflict, labeling it a civil war rather than a humanitarian catastrophe. The UN deployed peacekeepers, but with limited mandates and no authority to stop the violence. Embargoes and sanctions came too late and sometimes hit victims harder than aggressors. Diplomacy moved slower than the shells falling on Sarajevo. Western powers were divided. Some feared intervention would worsen the chaos, while others were paralyzed by post-Cold War uncertainty. It wasn't until the horrors of ethnic cleansing became undeniable that serious action was taken. NATO's first-ever combat operation would be born in the Balkans, not the Cold War. When diplomacy failed and atrocities mounted, NATO made a historic decision: military intervention. In 1995, after years of bloodshed and the Srebrenica genocide, NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force, a sustained bombing campaign against Bosnian Serb positions. It was the first combat operation in NATO's history, and a decisive shift in the war's trajectory. Airstrikes spoke where words had failed. Backed by US diplomacy, the bombing forced Serb leaders to the negotiating table. Just months later, the Dayton Accords were signed, ending the Bosnian War. While peace came at the cost of a deeply divided Bosnia, the intervention proved that international action, when decisive, could save lives. Peace arrived in 1995, but it wasn't unity, it was compromise carved in concrete. The Dayton Accords ended the Bosnian War by freezing the battlefield into a political blueprint. Bosnia and Herzegovina was preserved as a single state, but split into two autonomous entities, the Federation of Bosniaks and Croats and Republika Srpska. It was peace built on division, not reconciliation. The deal stopped the killing, but entrenched ethnic lines into government, education, and daily life. Power sharing created paralysis. Nationalist rhetoric remained dominant. Dayton didn't solve Bosnia's identity crisis. It cemented it. The war ended, but the wounds remained open. While the world exhaled after Bosnia, another storm brewed in Kosovo. This province, mostly ethnic Albanian but still part of Serbia, had long sought autonomy, only to face repression under Milosevic. By the late 1990s, tensions exploded. The Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, launched a guerrilla insurgency, and Serbia responded with overwhelming force, targeting not just rebels but entire communities. History repeated itself, this time with new victims. Massacres, mass expulsions, and scorched villages drew global outrage. NATO, once hesitant, intervened again in 1999 with a 78-day bombing campaign against Serbia. The war ended with Serbian withdrawal and UN administration, but not before deepening ethnic scars and setting the stage for Kosovo's controversial independence. Every fire starter eventually faces the flames. By 2000, Slobodan Milosevic, the man who once rallied crowds with nationalist fervor, was losing his grip. Years of war, economic collapse, and international sanctions had drained Serbia. Mass protests erupted after he tried to rig an election. The people had endured too much for too long. In just one day, his regime crumbled under the weight of its own lies. On October 5, 2000, hundreds of thousands flooded Belgrade. Police refused to fire. Parliament was set ablaze. By nightfall, Milosevic was gone, ousted by the very people he claimed to defend. The architect of Yugoslavia's unraveling would soon face justice in The Hague. After the dust settled, the question remained, would there be justice for the victims? The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, based in The Hague, set out to prosecute war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Leaders like Milosevic, Karadzic, and Mladic were indicted, and many faced trial. But justice moved slowly, too slowly for some. The trials dragged on for years, frustrating survivors and families seeking closure. Critics called the court politically selective. Others praised it as a milestone for international law. While many perpetrators were held accountable, many others walked free. The scars ran deeper than the verdicts could reach. In 2008, nearly a decade after war and UN oversight, Kosovo declared independence from Serbia. For many ethnic Albanians, it was the long-awaited final chapter in a painful struggle. But for Serbia and its allies, it was an illegal breakaway, a wound reopened. The world split over recognition. The US and much of Europe backed Kosovo. Russia, China, and others did not. Independence was declared, but unity wasn't. Serbs in northern Kosovo refused to acknowledge the new government. Tensions remained high, with periodic flare-ups and diplomatic deadlocks. While Kosovo built its own institutions, the question of full legitimacy still lingers on the world stage. Yugoslavia's breakup wasn't just a regional tragedy, it was a global warning. A country built on diversity, shared struggle, and socialist ideals collapsed into war, genocide, and lasting division. Why? Because identity without inclusion, autonomy without unity, and memory without truth become explosive. Strong institutions matter, but trust matters more. The story of Yugoslavia reminds us that peace is never permanent. It must be nurtured by justice, dialogue, and empathy. The moment leaders exploit fear instead of easing it, nations fracture, and when ordinary people stop seeing each other as neighbors, collapse becomes inevitable. Here's the unsettling truth. The conditions that tore Yugoslavia apart, economic crisis, populism, media manipulation, ethnic polarization, aren't confined to the past. They echo across the globe today, from fractured democracies to rising authoritarianism. The collapse didn't come overnight. It came from ignoring the signs. Some Balkan leaders still exploit identity politics. Others push for EU integration, while youth increasingly leave, frustrated by corruption and stagnation. The ghosts of Yugoslavia linger, not just in memory but in the decisions being made right now. The fall of Yugoslavia shows how fast unity can fracture, and how history can echo into the present. If you learn something new, subscribe to Time Scribed, where every moment in history is written in time.